Okay, let's dive right into this explainer of our source material and unpack the absolute surprise that is the US-Iran Memorandum of Understanding just announced by President Donald Trump. I mean, whatever prior assumptions you had about the Middle East, yeah, toss them out. The events of the last few days mean we've got to take a completely fresh look at everything. We are literally looking at a framework that has the potential to fundamentally alter the geopolitical map. But, as you'd expect, it's steeped in intense controversy. So, strictly based on the latest geopolitical analysis, we're going to break down exactly what is happening, why it's happening right now, and what the regional fallout actually looks like. Let's get into it.
To really wrap our heads around this complex, incredibly fast-moving situation, here is our roadmap for the explainer. We'll quickly cover the US-Iran MOU itself, the elusive search for a new Middle East, the shifting realities on the ground, the regional ripple effect, and finally, wrap up with this profound geopolitical transition.
Just look at the sheer ambition of this deal, which U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance is slated to sign over in Geneva. We're talking about the potential to remake the region and lead to lasting peace. Those are absolutely massive claims, right? Especially when you remember that Washington and Tehran have been locked in a bitter confrontation literally since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Now, sure, some analysts think this might be a bit of an overstatement, but there's zero doubt that this agreement is a historic attempt to completely redefine relations between two long-standing adversaries.
Okay, moving to Section 1, the US-Iran MOU, expanding beyond nuclear boundaries.
This really highlights the stark contrast between the Obama-era agreement and the new 2026 MOU. Think about the 2015 JCPOA. It was incredibly narrow, right? It focused almost entirely on capping Iran's nuclear program in exchange for targeted sanctions relief. Very specific. But the 2026 MOU, it's a totally different beast. While the nuclear question is obviously still central, this new framework goes way beyond that. It's built to broadly manage US-Iran tensions, drastically cut down the risk of direct military confrontation, and crucially, it throws in phased sanctions relief designed to support Iran's economic reconstruction after those devastating wars of 2025 and 2026. So the ambition here is huge, but you know how it goes. The broader the agenda, the harder it is to actually pull off.
Which brings us to the friction. Now, the full text isn't even public yet, but man, the immediate pushback is intense. We are seeing incredibly strong opposition from Israel, considerable criticism from within Washington, and serious internal dissent bubbling up in Tehran itself. And honestly, the fact that all three capitals are pushing back, it's a huge indicator that both the US and Iran had to swallow some massive, truly difficult concessions just to get to the table. Neither side got exactly what they wanted, which is the hallmark of any complex negotiation. But it also means the chance of this whole deal falling apart, yeah, it's very real.
So we really need to understand the historical ghosts haunting this new agreement. Let's look at Section 2, the elusive New Middle East, a cycle of diplomacy and breakdown.
If we just take a step back and track Middle Eastern diplomacy across the decades, it's almost like a giant, frustrating loop. We see a recurring cycle where these proclaimed turning points ultimately just dissolve back into conflict. Back in the 1990s, we had the Oslo peace process. Then, in 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was supposed to reshape the region. After that came the Arab Spring in 2011 and the Abraham Accords in 2020. Every single one of these moments was hyped up as the decisive turning point that would finally usher in a new Middle East. And yet, we still ended up in the brutal wars of 2025 and 2026. So for decades, the region has essentially been trapped in this exhausting cycle of war, proxy conflict, and diplomatic breakdown. So, with all those failed attempts at a so-called New Middle East in the rearview mirror, we have to objectively ask the big question, could it actually be different this time? Can this current framework break that vicious cycle? Look, skeptics will absolutely argue that meaningful change here is impossible, or that these entrenched rivalries are just way too deep to ever overcome. But as we know, change is pretty much the only constant in international politics. So we really have to figure out why these two historical adversaries are suddenly so willing to negotiate such a broad framework right at this specific moment.
And that brings us to Section 3, shifting realities, and the pragmatism driving historical adversaries. What's driving this is a fascinating mix of contrast and surprising similarity. Simply put, the bills have come due for both players. In the US, there is this profound, truly bipartisan exhaustion with the forever wars. Whether you're looking at the political left or the right in Washington, everyone wants out of permanent conflict. Plus, they are suddenly a lot more willing to question some very long-standing policy assumptions regarding Israel. On the flip side, Iran is facing a really harsh reality check. Their strategy of regional expansion was essentially the defining story of the last 20 years. But those recent wars in 2025 and 2026, they completely exposed the immense, devastating costs of that strategy. Iran's economy is under severe strain, and its regional partners are significantly weaker. The leadership in Tehran has finally realized something crucial. Sure, they have formidable deterrents, like those crazy underground missile cities carved straight into the mountains, but you just can't run a country on deterrents alone. Missiles don't rebuild a shattered economy. So at the end of the day, both sides are being driven by sheer, exhausted pragmatism.
Now, having said all that about mutual war fatigue, we do need to be crystal clear about the power dynamics here. Because despite stepping back, President Trump has completely reaffirmed that the U.S. is not abandoning its role as the primary geopolitical anchor in the region. Not by a long shot. Whether we're talking about Gaza or the Gulf, the United States remains the absolute principal external force shaping the Middle East. Essentially, they're looking to manage these rivalries, not just walk away from the chessboard entirely.
So, how are the neighbors taking all this? Let's check out Section 4, the regional ripple effect, balancing skepticism versus stability.
Regionally, a really sharp contrast is starting to emerge. On one hand, you have Israel, who remains deeply skeptical of any kind of U.S.-Iran accommodation. I mean, for years, Israeli leadership has built their entire vision around containing Iran and even pushing for regime change. But that approach is seriously losing traction in Washington right now, and growing political divisions inside Israel are making their regional strategy a lot more complicated. But then, flip over to the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is wild. Back in 2015, they looked at the JCPOA and called it American appeasement. Today, complete 180. They have totally shifted their stance. Why? Because right now, they are prioritizing massive economic transformation. The recent conflicts basically prove to them that all their extraordinary wealth and those gleaming new megacities are incredibly vulnerable to war. So, believe it or not, the Gulf states now need regional de-escalation and stability just as desperately as Iran does.
Of course, we have to neutrally acknowledge that some very deep-seated distrust is still there, and we've got ongoing active conflicts in 4 major nations: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. These zones are generating serious instability, and honestly, they are the wildcards here. These are the exact friction points that could easily threaten or just completely blow up the entire MOU. So the ink might dry in Geneva, sure, but managing the chaos in these active theaters, that is where the real test of this agreement actually lies.
Finally, let's zoom out to the global implications. Section 5, a profound geopolitical transition, looking at the global stakes and India's evolving role.
Because for a rising power like India, what goes down in the Middle East isn't just distant news. It is a matter of direct domestic security and economic survival. India has massive vested interest on the line here. Any move toward diffusing conflict is a huge win for them, primarily because they have a massive diaspora living and working in the region that needs protecting. Plus, India relies heavily on the Gulf for vital energy security, and those recent wars were a very real threat to their economic stability. Because these stakes are literally sky high, analysts are noting that this de-escalation is essentially forcing India to step up. Instead of just playing it safe as a risk-averse bystander, India is being pushed to take an active, stabilizing role in Middle Eastern politics, most likely teaming up in coalitions with partner nations.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, really crucial thought from our sources. Look, it might be a bit premature to pop the champagne and proclaim that a peaceful new Middle East has officially arrived, but make no mistake, the old order, it has been permanently shaken. Whether this incredibly complex U.S.-Iran MOU survives the massive domestic pushback, or whether it just crumbles under the weight of decades of regional distrust, the Middle East is smack in the middle of a profound transition. So as these traditional alignments are being completely redrawn, the big question you've got to ask yourself is this: what happens to the entire global balance of power if the U.S. and Iran actually succeed in shifting from a state of permanent confrontation to managed rivalry? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer of the source material. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.